July Parker sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The sterile, wood-paneled courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the whispers from the crowded benches feeling like 1,000 tiny needles pricking her skin. She tried to focus on her breathing, willing herself to remain composed, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her chest. Across the room, David Parker leaned back in his chair, exuding smug confidence. His sharp navy suit fit him perfectly, and his air of entitlement seemed to fill the room. He exchanged a few words with his attorney, then laughed, loud enough for everyone to hear. July flinched at the sound. Her eyes flickered toward her own attorney, Sarah Mitchell, who offered her a reassuring nod. "You're doing fine," Sarah whispered, her tone calm and measured. "Don't let him get to you. Just breathe." July nodded, though her heart raced. How had it come to this? There had been a time when she had loved David deeply. She had believed in him, supported him, sacrificed for him. Now they stood as strangers in a courtroom, their marriage dissected under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights and the scrutiny of strangers. David stood, breaking her train of thought. His voice was smooth, practiced, and full of condescension. "Your Honor," he began, addressing the bench with a flourish, "let's not waste any more of the court's valuable time. It's clear that this marriage has been over for years. My wife has proven incapable of meeting me on equal ground, emotionally, financially, or intellectually. This divorce is the best outcome for both of us." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom gallery. July's cheeks flushed hot with humiliation, but she kept her head down. Sarah shot to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Parker is speculating and making disparaging comments that have no bearing on this case." Judge Rebecca Owens, a stern woman with sharp features, raised her hand for silence. Sustained. "Mr. Parker, stick to the facts." David smirked, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Apologies, Your Honor. I only meant to state the obvious." Then, turning his attention to July, he delivered the blow. "July isn't the woman I married. She's fragile, insecure, a shadow of the person she once was." The words hit like a slap. July clenched her fists under the table, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from crying. David's attorney stood and began listing what he called the facts. He painted David as a hard-working provider burdened by an emotionally dependent wife. He described how July had left her career early in their marriage, insinuating laziness and lack of ambition. Sarah leaned close to July. "They're trying to paint you as weak," she murmured. "But we know the truth." July didn't reply. Her stomach churned, but she met Sarah's gaze and nodded. The courtroom felt suffocating as David's witnesses, friends, colleagues, took the stand. They described him as a dedicated husband and provider. They spoke of his success, his charm, and his supposed sacrifices. Not a single one mentioned the nights he came home drunk, the sharp words he used to cut her down, or the cold way he ignored her after she gave up her dreams to support his. When the judge called for a recess, July followed Sarah into a quiet hallway. "Are you ready for what's next?" Sarah asked. July looked at her attorney. For the first time all day, she felt something stir within her. Beneath the layers of fear and exhaustion, a spark of determination burned. "I'm ready," she said. July sat alone in the courthouse hallway, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the table. The cold walls seemed to close in, amplifying the echo of distant footsteps. She closed her eyes, letting her mind drift back to a time when life felt simpler, when David's smile had made her heart flutter instead of ache. They had met at a college fundraiser. He was charming, ambitious, and funny, everything July thought she wanted. She had been studying art history, full of dreams and passion, and David had swept her off her feet. He talked about building a future together, a home filled with laughter and love. In those early years, he had made her feel like she was the center of his universe. He brought flowers just because, planned weekend trips, and whispered promises of forever. July gave him her whole heart, never doubting his words. But forever had been an illusion. The cracks began to show after their wedding. David's ambitious nature turned into obsession. His work always came first. Dinners went cold while he stayed late at the office. Date nights became canceled plans. The man who once held her hand across the table now barely looked up from his phone. Still, July held on. She believed in vows and second chances. She convinced herself it was just a rough patch. She tried harder, keeping the house spotless, cooking his favorite meals, even stepping away from her art to focus on supporting his career. And then came the fire. July's breath caught as the memory flooded back. It was late at night, and David had fallen asleep on the couch with a lit cigarette. She woke to smoke and flames, her lungs burning as she searched for him in the haze. He had been unconscious, trapped behind the coffee table. She didn't hesitate. Ignoring the flames licking at her nightgown, July dragged him out, choking on smoke. The burns came later, the searing pain, the surgeries, the endless recovery. But David survived. At first, he seemed grateful. He sat by her hospital bed, holding her hand and promising to be better. For a brief moment, she thought the fire had reignited their love. But as her scars healed, so did his guilt. Gratitude turned to resentment. He avoided looking at her injuries, and she began wearing long sleeves to hide them. He stopped touching her. Stopped seeing her. The final blow came a year later. David told her he felt trapped, that her presence was a constant reminder of that night and everything he wanted to forget. Now, sitting outside the courtroom, July felt the weight of every choice she had made for him. She had risked her life to save his, and he had repaid her with humiliation. A door opened, and Sarah stepped out. "We're ready to go back in," she said softly. July stood, smoothing her skirt. Her heart pounded, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was resolve. As she walked toward the courtroom, her scars didn't feel like burdens anymore. They felt like armor. July stepped back into the courtroom, her shoulders squared but her palms damp with sweat. The air inside felt heavier than before, the murmurs of spectators barely masking the tension crackling between the tables. She caught a glimpse of David as he leaned back in his chair, wearing the same infuriating smirk he'd had since the trial began. Her stomach tightened. Sarah Mitchell gave her a reassuring look as she flipped through her notes. "We've got this," she whispered. But July wasn't so sure. The judge's gavel came down, calling the room to order. "We'll resume proceedings," Judge Owens announced, her voice steady and firm. "Mr. Parker, you may continue." David's attorney, a sharp-looking man named Richard Hayes, rose from his chair. He adjusted his tie and strode toward the bench. "Thank you, Your Honor," he began, his tone oozing confidence. "Let's get back to the matter at hand. Mr. Parker's generous support throughout this marriage and his wife's inability to uphold her responsibilities as a partner." Sarah bristled beside July, but she didn't interrupt. "Not yet. Let's start with the financial records," Richard continued. "We've already established that Mr. Parker was the primary provider, earning a stable and impressive income. Meanwhile, Mrs. Parker has failed to contribute meaningfully to the household." A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom. July's cheeks burned, but she kept her gaze fixed straight ahead. Richard gestured dramatically. "Mr. Parker paid the bills, funded their lifestyle, and even supported Mrs. Parker's artistic hobbies." He smirked as if the words themselves were laughable. Yet she remained unemployed and emotionally dependent on him for years. Sarah shot to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making subjective statements designed to undermine my client's character." "Sustained," Judge Owens replied. "Stick to the facts, Mr. Hayes." "My apologies, Your Honor," Richard said smoothly. Then he turned toward July. "Mrs. Parker, would you care to explain to the court why you abandoned your career?" The room went silent. July's throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I didn't abandon it," she said, her voice steady. "I chose to prioritize my husband's career. I believed in his dreams and supported him. That was a decision we made together." Richard raised an eyebrow. And yet, despite your so-called support, your husband claims you became distant and emotionally unstable. Would you like to address that? Sarah stood again. Objection, argumentative. Sustained. But the damage was done. The words hung in the air, and July felt the judgmental stares from the gallery. Richard called David to the stand. David adjusted his tie as he stepped forward, flashing a quick smile at the crowd. He looked every bit the charming, put-together man he portrayed himself to be. "Mr. Parker," Richard began, "can you describe your experience in this marriage?" David sighed dramatically. "I tried, I really did. But July, she changed. She stopped caring about herself. She became distant, insecure, and, honestly, it felt like I was living with a ghost." July's nails dug into her palms. "So you're saying you felt unsupported?" Richard pressed. "Absolutely," David said. "I felt like I was carrying the weight of our entire lives. And no matter what I did, it was never enough for her." Sarah leaned toward July. "Stay calm. He's playing to the crowd, but we'll have our turn." July nodded faintly, but her mind was already racing. The lies, the half-truths, they were turning her into the villain of her own story. And the worst part? The crowd seemed to believe him. When Sarah cross-examined, her questions poked holes in David's testimony. She brought up text messages where he belittled July, photos of vacations where she smiled beside him, hiding her unhappiness. But David deflected each point with practiced ease, spinning the narrative in his favor. By the time he stepped down, July felt cornered, as if the walls were closing in. Sarah turned to her. "They're setting this up as an open and shut case," she whispered. "But they don't know what's coming." July exhaled slowly, gripping the edges of her chair. She wasn't ready to reveal her truth, not yet. But the time was coming. And when it did, David wouldn't be smiling anymore. July sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, her pulse thrumming in her ears as the echoes of David's words lingered in the air. He sat confidently in his chair, his polished shoes tapping lightly against the floor, as if this entire proceeding was nothing more than a formality. She wanted to scream, to shout the truth so loudly that it shattered the carefully constructed image he had built around himself. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she steadied herself as Sarah rose from her chair. "The plaintiff would like to call Mrs. July Parker to the stand." The room fell silent as July stood, smoothing the hem of her skirt. She could feel the weight of every set of eyes on her, but she lifted her chin and stepped forward. The bailiff swore her in, and she sat down, folding her hands in her lap to hide their slight trembling. "Mrs. Parker," Sarah began, her voice calm and steady, "how long were you and Mr. Parker married?" 10 years, July replied, her voice soft but clear. "And during those 10 years, what was your role in the marriage?" "I supported David," July said, glancing toward him briefly before focusing back on Sarah. "I left my job so he could focus on building his career. I took care of the house, the bills, and every detail of our lives so he wouldn't have to worry." David shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but Sarah pressed on. "And did you ever feel appreciated for those sacrifices?" July hesitated. She could feel the lump forming in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "At first, yes. But as the years passed, I felt invisible. Like everything I did was expected, not valued." "And what about the incident 3 years ago?" A hush fell over the room. David stiffened. "The fire?" July asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes. Can you tell the court what happened that night?" David's attorney jumped up. "Objection. Relevance?" Sarah turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this incident speaks directly to the sacrifices my client made and the physical and emotional toll they took on her." Judge Owens nodded. "Overruled. Proceed." July drew in a shaky breath. It was late. David had fallen asleep on the couch after having a few drinks. "I woke up to the smell of smoke and found the living room on fire. He was unconscious." Her voice caught, and she paused before continuing. I dragged him out of the house. The fire spread quickly, and I didn't have time to think. I just acted. And what happened after that? Sarah asked gently. I suffered third-degree burns on my back and sides. I spent months in the hospital and even longer in recovery. Did David ever express gratitude for what you did? For the first time, July's voice cracked. He did, at first. But over time, he started resenting me. He said looking at me reminded him of what happened. He stopped touching me. He stopped talking to me. David stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. Sit down, Mr. Parker, the judge barked, and the room fell silent again. Sarah took a step closer. Mrs. Parker, you mentioned physical scars. Are you prepared to show the court what you've been hiding? July froze. She wasn't ready, not yet. But then her eyes locked with Sarah's, and she saw the confidence there. Yes, she said. Sarah turned to the judge. Your Honor, we request a recess so my client can prepare her next statement. Judge Owens nodded. Court will reconvene in 20 minutes. The gavel struck, and July felt her chest tighten. As she followed Sarah into the hallway, the whispers began again. Are you sure about this? Sarah asked once they were alone. July closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them, there was fire behind them. Yes. It's time. The courtroom fell silent as July re-entered, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She held her head high, though her stomach churned with nerves. Sarah walked beside her, carrying a folder of documents, but July knew no piece of paper could prepare anyone for what was about to happen. David sat at his table, his arms crossed and his jaw tight. For the first time, his confidence seemed to waver. His eyes flickered toward July, then quickly away, as if he already sensed the shift in power. All rise, the bailiff announced as Judge Owens returned to her seat. Once everyone settled, the judge's sharp eyes fell on Sarah. You may proceed, she said. Sarah stood, walking purposefully toward the center of the room. Your Honor, the plaintiff would like to submit physical evidence to demonstrate the sacrifices she made during her marriage and the impact those sacrifices had on her life. With the court's permission, Mrs. Parker is prepared to share her story, visually. David's attorney shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is theatrical and irrelevant. We're here to discuss finances and contributions to the marriage, not to dramatize emotional wounds. Judge Owens raised her hand, silencing the outburst. Overruled. I'll allow it. July's heart pounded. She rose slowly, every muscle in her body tense as she stepped into the open space between the tables. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes, each one dissecting her, but she refused to let fear stop her now. She reached for the zipper at the back of her dress and hesitated for the briefest moment. Then, with a steady breath, she lowered it, slipping the fabric off her shoulders and letting it fall to her waist. Gasps echoed through the room. Her skin, once flawless, was now a tapestry of scars, red, raised, and unforgiving. Burns covered her back and sides, evidence of the night she had risked everything to save the man who now sat frozen in his chair. July stood tall, resisting the urge to cover herself. She let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment sink in. I wasn't always like this, she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. I used to be confident. I used to feel beautiful. But 3 years ago, everything changed. She turned slightly, revealing the full extent of her scars. I didn't hesitate that night. I ran into the fire to save him, even though it meant risking my life. And this, she gestured to her body. This is what I was left with. David's face had gone pale. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. I spent months in the hospital, July continued, her voice gaining strength. Months of surgeries, pain, and therapy. And through it all, I believed it would be worth it because I was saving my marriage. Saving him. She turned her gaze to David, her eyes sharp. But instead of gratitude, I got shame. Instead of love, I got disgust. He couldn't even look at me without wincing, as if my scars were something I should apologize for. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. I gave everything for him. My career, my confidence, my health. And when I needed him the most, he abandoned me. The gallery erupted in whispers. Some looked at David with pity, others glared at him in disgust. He shrank back in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Sarah stepped forward. "Mrs. Parker, are you saying that your sacrifices, both emotional and physical, were disregarded by your husband?" "Yes," July said firmly. "And not just disregarded, mocked. Dismissed. He made me feel like I wasn't enough, even after I nearly died saving him." "Objection." David's attorney stood again, his voice shaky. "This is emotional manipulation." Judge Owens slammed her gavel. "Overruled. Mr. Hayes, sit down." Sarah turned back to July. "And what do you hope to achieve today, Mrs. Parker?" July's eyes locked on David's. "Justice. And freedom, from him, from his words, from the prison he put me in." Silence followed. David shifted uncomfortably, wiping sweat from his brow. The judge cleared her throat. "This court will take a short recess before final arguments," she said, though her voice had softened. The gavel fell, and July let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. As she reached for her dress, Sarah draped a shawl over her shoulders and whispered, "You did it." But July wasn't so sure. She felt exposed, raw, and unsure of what came next. As she sat back down, David avoided her gaze completely. For the first time, July saw him not as the man she once loved, but as someone small, someone who could no longer control her. The courtroom remained eerily silent as the recess ended. The gallery whispered in hushed tones, the weight of July's revelation still hanging heavy in the air. Even as the judge called for order, the murmurs persisted, low voices speculating, sympathizing, and condemning. July sat at the plaintiff's table, her shoulders straighter than before. The shawl draped over her scars felt more like armor than a cover. Sarah leaned in, her voice low but steady. "They're with you now," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "Stay strong." July nodded, though her heart still pounded. Across the aisle, David fidgeted in his seat, his once unshakable confidence crumbling under the weight of judgmental stares. His attorney leaned in, whispering frantically, but David barely responded. "Court is now back in session," Judge Owens announced, her voice commanding enough to quiet the whispers. She turned to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, you may proceed with final questioning." Sarah stood, her heels clicking confidently as she approached the witness stand where July remained seated. "Mrs. Parker," Sarah began, "thank you for your bravery earlier. I know how difficult it was to share your story, but I have just a few more questions before we conclude." July folded her hands in her lap, nodding. "In the years following the fire, did Mr. Parker ever acknowledge the sacrifices you made for him?" "No," July replied, her voice cleared despite the tremor in her chest. "If anything, he resented me for them." "Can you elaborate?" "He avoided me," she said, glancing briefly toward David before continuing. "He wouldn't touch me, wouldn't look at me. He said my scars reminded him of what happened, but really, I think they reminded him of his guilt. Instead of facing it, he pushed me away." David shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. "And despite all of this," Sarah pressed, "you stayed?" "I did," July admitted. "Because I thought if I just tried harder, if I was patient enough, things would get better. But they didn't." "He didn't." Sarah stepped closer. "And when did you decide enough was enough?" July drew a deep breath. "The night he told me I was a burden." Gasps rippled through the gallery. David's attorney stood abruptly, but Judge Owens fixed him with a sharp glare. He sank back down without a word. Sarah didn't miss a beat. "A burden?" "Yes." July's voice broke, but she didn't stop. "He said I was damaged. That I'd always be broken, and he didn't want to be reminded of it anymore. A heavy silence fell over the room. David sat frozen, his face pale and his hands trembling as if he finally understood the consequences of his words. "No further questions, Your Honor," Sarah said, stepping away from the witness stand. Judge Owens turned to David's attorney. "Mr. Hayes, do you wish to cross-examine?" Hayes hesitated. He glanced at David, whose eyes were fixed on the table in front of him. After a long pause, Hayes rose slowly. "No questions, Your Honor." The gallery erupted into whispers again, but Judge Owens silenced them with a single strike of her gavel. "Very well," she said. "We'll proceed to closing arguments." Sarah returned to the plaintiff's table, placing a reassuring hand on July's arm. "You've done everything you needed to," she whispered. "Now we let the truth speak for itself." July exhaled, her hands no longer trembling. For the first time in years, she felt free, not from judgment or scars, but from the chains of silence that had bound her for so long. As Sarah began her closing argument, July watched David out of the corner of her eye. His shoulders slumped, his head lowered. He looked smaller than she'd ever seen him, no longer the larger-than-life figure who had once dominated her world. Her scars hadn't broken her. They had made her stronger. And as she sat there, listening to Sarah lay out the final pieces of her case, July realized something profound. She wasn't just fighting for freedom from David. She was fighting for herself. The courtroom emptied slowly, the weight of July's testimony leaving a hush in its wake. Spectators whispered as they passed by, their eyes flicking toward her, some filled with sympathy, others with quiet admiration. July stood near the window, her gaze fixed on the rain streaking down the glass, blurring the world outside. Footsteps echoed behind her. She didn't turn. She already knew who it was. July. David's voice was softer than she remembered, less sharp, less certain. But it wasn't enough to make her face him. "July, please." Finally, she turned, but her expression was unreadable. David stood just a few feet away, his posture tense, his eyes darting between her face and the scars she no longer bothered to hide. "What do you want, David?" Her voice was calm, steady. He hesitated, shoving his hands into his pockets. I didn't know it had gotten this far. I didn't think." "You didn't think?" July cut him off, her tone harder now. "You didn't think when you mocked me? When you treated me like I was broken? Or when you told me I was a burden after everything I gave up for you?" David flinched but didn't retreat. "I know I messed up, okay? I panicked. After the fire, everything changed. I felt trapped." July shook her head, disbelief washing over her. "Trapped? You weren't the one trapped, David. You weren't the one who spent months in the hospital, relearning how to move, to sleep without pain, to look in the mirror and see someone worth loving." His shoulders sagged. "I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," July said. "Over and over again. And the worst part? You made me believe it was my fault." David opened his mouth, but she didn't give him the chance to speak. "You made me feel small. Invisible. Worthless. And I let you." Her voice cracked, but she pushed through it. "I let you because I thought I owed you something for surviving that night. But I don't owe you anything, David. Not anymore." Tears welled in his eyes, but July felt nothing, not anger, not pity, just a quiet sense of finality. "Is this it, then?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. July nodded. "This is it." David stared at her for a long moment before turning to leave. He paused at the door but didn't look back. When the door closed behind him, July felt the last thread binding her to him snap. She let out a shaky breath, leaning against the cool glass of the window. "You okay?" Sarah's voice pulled her back. She turned to see her attorney standing in the doorway, a soft smile playing at her lips. "I am," July said, and for the first time in years, she meant it. Sarah walked over and handed her a folded piece of paper. "The judge will give her ruling tomorrow, but honestly, I don't think you have anything to worry about. July unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the lines of financial agreements and property settlements. It wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about reclaiming her life, and today, she had done exactly that. What now? Sarah asked. July smiled faintly, her hand brushing over the paper before tucking it into her bag. I start over. Sarah grinned. Well, I think you're more than ready for that. As July stepped outside into the rain, she tilted her face upward, letting the drops wash over her. They felt cold and sharp, but also cleansing, like a baptism marking the beginning of something new. For the first time in years, July didn't feel like a victim. She felt free. The morning sun streamed through the wide windows of July's small apartment, bathing the space in a golden glow. It wasn't much, a modest one-bedroom with mismatched furniture and shelves lined with books and sketches, but it was hers. For the first time in years, July felt at home. She stood in front of the mirror, running her fingers along the edges of the scars on her side. They no longer felt foreign. They no longer felt like a burden. They were hers too, symbols of survival, strength, and sacrifice. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was Sarah. Final ruling came in. Everything settled as we expected. It's done. Officially. Congratulations, July. Call me if you need anything. July smiled, setting the phone down. No tears came. No pang of regret. Just peace. The ruling granted her what she needed, financial security and full ownership of the small art studio she had opened before the fire, a place she hadn't set foot in since her recovery. Now, that place was about to become her sanctuary again. She slipped on her coat and grabbed her keys. The studio smelled faintly of paint and wood shavings when July stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, and half-finished canvases lined the walls, remnants of the artist she had been before her world changed. She ran her fingers over one of the paintings, its colors vibrant and chaotic. Back then, she had poured her emotions onto canvas, unafraid of what the world might see. But then the fire had happened. And David. And shame. Not anymore. July pulled a blank canvas onto the easel and stared at it. Her hand hovered over the palette, unsure where to start. Her scars itched beneath her sweater, but instead of covering them, she rolled up her sleeves. She picked up the brush. The first stroke was hesitant. Then another. And another. Colors bloomed, deep reds, soft golds, and streaks of blue that blended into shadows. With each sweep of the brush, she felt lighter. Stronger. Like she was piecing herself back together one color at a time. Hours passed, and July barely noticed. When she finally stepped back, her breath caught. The painting was raw, fiery swirls edged with dark shadows but streaked with light breaking through. It was chaos and beauty, pain and hope. It was her. She wiped her hands on her apron, a small smile tugging at her lips. For so long, David's voice had filled her head, reminding her of who she couldn't be, of what she had lost. But now, all she could hear was the hum of possibility. Her phone rang again, pulling her from the moment. This time, it wasn't Sarah. It was a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated before answering. Hello? Mrs. Parker, a woman's voice said. My name is Amy Roberts. I saw the article about your case in the paper this morning and, she paused. I wanted to say thank you. Thank you? July asked, confused. Yes. For speaking out. For showing that we don't have to stay quiet. Your story, it's powerful. July swallowed hard. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Amy said. You've already said enough. The call ended, leaving July standing there, her heart pounding. Maybe this wasn't just about her. Maybe her story, the scars, the strength, the fight, could be something more. She turned back to the canvas, her fingers tingling. That night, July sat by the window of her apartment, a cup of tea warming her hands. The city lights glittered in the distance, and for the first time, she felt no fear about what came next. She thought about David, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He had been a chapter in her story, but not the whole book. Her scars no longer defined her. They empowered her. And as she gazed out at the endless horizon, July smiled. This was her rebirth.